In the early days of your teaching career, if you're teaching for the first time, you're probably filled with excitement and energy and optimism. But what happens 25 years down the road, when you've been teaching for so long that everything that happens seems terribly familiar? Everything seems like a rerun of something you've done before. Every vocation can become dull through repetition and familiarity, teaching included. But the best teachers find ways to prevent that feeling of monotony setting in and retain a freshness in their teaching throughout their entire careers. How do you do that? Well, I think we've got more opportunities than most professionals to stay alert and to stay motivated. After all, just think about the people we're meeting each term. They're young, bright, healthy, eager for experience. They haven't yet been beaten down by the hard world. And sometimes they're practically utopian in their eagerness to change the world. Some of their optimism ought to rub off on us, I think, reminding us that even if the curriculum is the same, the people to whom we're teaching it are constantly changing. And besides, the curriculum ought not to stay the same. All the disciplines are changing rapidly as new scholarship, new inventions, and new experiences help us to see the world differently. If you're a conscientious teacher, you should read as much of the new research as possible and incorporate relevant parts of it into your teaching. Better still, participate in the research and writing. It's possible to divide your time between research and teaching so that the two actually support one another beautifully. The field of pedagogy itself has expanded greatly in the last few decades. There's always something new to learn about teaching itself. Keeping up on the new approaches to teaching can also be very helpful in keeping your enthusiasm alive, trying out new things. Students themselves, meanwhile, derive a great deal of satisfaction and benefit from knowing that they're learning not just from someone who's digested the books, but from someone who's actually doing it, who's actually currently at work as a research scholar. Let me talk about that point first. The disciplines never stand still, and conscientious teachers need to keep up with changes in their field. And the changes have been extremely rapid, perhaps most of all in the sciences over the last century. Think of the way in which plate tectonics revolutionized geology in the 1960s and 70s. Suddenly the whole field was opened up. In the same decades, the 50s, 60s and 70s, the discovery of DNA transformed the life sciences in those years. Advances in the manufacture and quality of scientific equipment has also had an enormous impact upon the way in which work is done, and great new possibilities for exploration. Think about electron microscopes perfected over the last half century and the Hubble telescope. Between them, they've made it far more possible for us to explore the intricacies of inner space on the one hand, right down to the molecular and almost to the atomic level, and to explore the farthest reaches of the galaxy and the universe at the other. A personal anecdote here. I remember that when I studied biology in England in about 1970, diagrams of cells were very, very simple things. I was astonished when I saw my daughter's biology textbook 32 or 3 years later at how many things were in the cells. In my day, they simply hadn't been discovered. Now, cell diagrams are much more complicated today, and that's a testament to how much better our ability to understand the cells has become in the meantime. Even seemingly less dynamic fields like history have been transformed over the last half century. And I mentioned this previously, and let me stress it again. Social phenomena, new things happening in the world in our own time, affect the way we think about the past. When the civil rights movement took place, for example, in the 50s and 60s, historians began to re-explore the history of race relations and to look in different ways at black-white relations in view of their changed idea about how the races ought to interact in the present. Exactly the same is true of the women's movement, which created the field of women's history, and the environmental movement, which created the field of environmental history, one of the things I now teach. Teachers, above all, should be lifelong learners. They should never stop struggling to keep abreast of changes in their disciplines. Now, Professor Hale, our archaeologist, keeps up to date with paleoanthropology, and then he brings his findings to bear in a lecture on the artifacts he's brought in from the local state historical society. And one of the reasons it's such a pleasure to be in his classroom is because he's so lively and so energetic as he shows each new artifact.
This thing is called a maul, M-A-U-L. These things are found at flint quarries. They were used by the prehistoric miners, M-I-N-E-R-S, as they went after the flint that was embedded in the limestone. I didn't realize how these things worked till I got to the archaeological site of Santorini, or Thera, over in the Aegean Sea, north of Crete. The spear thrower has a hook at one end. You hold the spear thrower in this hand, the hook goes around the butt end of your spear, and as you throw it, it gives you not just the upper part of your arm, the lower part of your arm, an additional section to your arm, the spear thrower itself, high up in the air, propelling that spear towards a target. Now pottery shows us some new changes. You saw the small ones over here, the very beginnings of pottery. Look at this. Somebody's having a party. Somebody is inviting lots of people to the lodge who are going to be impressed by the fact that you have got a duck-shaped serving bowl.
I think it's a wonderful moment when he says, somebody's having a party. Part of maintaining your own enthusiasm is related to bringing good humour into your instruction, which is obviously something that John Hale specialises in. At the college level, we don't merely read the new literature, we write it as well. Participation in research and writing should also prevent the onset of dullness. And if you do it carefully, it's possible to make your research interact symbiotically with your teaching. They can actually help each other. Students certainly enjoy professors' accounts of their original research and can sometimes be galvanized into action, working harder than ever because of the fact that the teacher is a pioneer in this particular field of research, and they like the fact of direct contact with such a person.
The lectures of mine that get the best reactions from students, and often are mentioned at the end of the semester on the evaluations, are where I'm describing my own fieldwork. They feel validated to be in a class hearing firsthand from someone who discovered something about it in a way that they do not if I have simply synthesized or presented somebody else's research, no matter how effectively I do it. The fact that I can put up images that I took with my own camera of discoveries in the field at a University of Louisville excavation in Portugal, or my own fieldwork at Delphi in Greece, or 2,000 feet below the Aegean Sea looking at an amphora from a shipwreck that nobody's seen in 2,500 years, they love that. So I like that too.
You might discuss in class the research you're doing yourself, the kind of questions you're researching which are related in some way to the teaching you're doing. Besides making a very effective point about education, that the teacher is someone who's also dedicated to learning continuously, the excitement that you can communicate about your own work can generate more enthusiasm in the students themselves. On the other hand, you do need to be careful about this. I don't mean to say that the students are always going to love hearing you talk about your own research. If you're working on details about the Nestorian heresy, maybe 5 minutes every couple of weeks is going to be enough. Balance it and be sensible. Now, there's no question that apportioning your time judiciously to teaching and research can be problematical. Junior faculty members, especially at competitive campuses, are terribly preoccupied by the need to secure tenure, and they tend to devote too much time to their research and writing because they're afraid that otherwise they won't get tenure. Now, the tenure system is a very mixed blessing from the point of view of the students. It's sometimes abused by lazy underachievers. It almost certainly doesn't benefit the students. The idea of the tenure system is a very good one. The idea is that it will protect creative thinkers, even if their ideas are unpopular, and it'll protect them against dismissal by administrations for political reasons. But on the other hand, what actually happens is that some people get tenure, and rather than encouraging them to think daring new thoughts, it encourages them to think almost no thoughts at all. That is, having got tenure, they tend to relax. And unfortunately, that can be very bad as a consequence for students. So sometimes the students suffer beforehand because the professor's too preoccupied with research, and sometimes the teachers afterwards become lazy and don't do the research they should be doing, and that also communicates it into other parts of the teacher's life. So tenure, although it's a central part of American academic life, isn't entirely a benefit from the student's point of view. As I've said many times in this course, the teacher should want the students to be alert and a little bit anxious. But isn't it equally true that the students ought to want their teachers to be alert and a little bit anxious? I think there's a fair reciprocity there. One of the very best gifts you can give to your students is to show how a professional teacher is also a professional practiced learner, who sometimes faces difficult research problems too. Now, in American academic life today, the professional rewards of superstar research frequently serve to cloister the leading scholars from contact and interaction with students. Many of the rewards you get for outstanding scholarship are things like the reward of not having to teach. And sophisticated students are aware that some of their teachers are really more preoccupied with their research than with teaching. Do you think that the research and teaching go together, or that the one tends to interrupt the other?
I feel that they do go together, but at a certain point, a teacher can become very involved in their own research, and just dislike it when that happens because they seem to forget about teaching and they're not available for you to speak with them if you need help. If the students want to talk about something, they're fairly distant, or you just can't make an appointment with them, you can't see them.
One major complaint of students here, especially in certain departments, is that the teachers who are there are researchers by training, and their interest is in their research. So they teach because they have to teach, and there are people who are brilliant individuals, but they just don't have the skill to explain the complex concepts that they're able to understand to other people, and that's usually where I feel like there's a huge disconnect between the teacher and the student.
So the students are aware of the problem. Still, conscientious professors will bring the insights of their research into the classroom by analogy, if not directly. And this, as I said, can have the effect of kindling new enthusiasm in the students. Research, even more than wide reading, reminds you of how uncertain knowledge often is, especially right at the frontiers of our ability to grasp it. I did have a very pleasant experience, actually, in this respect, linking research with writing. In the fall of 2009, I was teaching my freshman seminar on the American conservative tradition, and earlier in that year, in May of 2009, I published a book called The Conservatives, a history of American conservatism throughout American history. So the two went together very nicely. My research led into my teaching, and I used it as the textbook for this class itself. The assignment for Friday is chapter 2 of the book The Conservatives by a well-known historian. And the person reading the introduction that time will be this Greg, right? All right. Each week, the freshmen read a chapter of that book and then several of the main documents that I referred to in those chapters. I had been a little bit hesitant about using it because I didn't want to get into lengthy monologues about why I'd written it the way I did. It worked out fine in practice because the nature of the book is that it just creates a sort of underlying narrative, and then our discussion focused on these primary documents, so the book gave some useful background information which they could bring to bear on the documents themselves. Assigning your own work can be difficult, though. I do remember vividly that when I was at graduate school, I once had two professors who were team teaching, and one week we read books by both of them, and they both said, of course we want the same kind of free, frank discussion that we always have. But when students did in fact begin to criticize these books, the teachers couldn't take it. They were too intellectually defensive, and they sort of hammered into the ground anybody who dared to criticize them in any way. So that was clearly a failed example of professors using their own work with the students. Of course, being an active researcher helps you to decipher the apparently confident and incontrovertible language of the textbooks, to say to the students, when you see this sentence, what the author is really doing is bringing together the following people's insights and making them sound as though it's all definite and confident, even though actually some of this research is still hypothetical and a little bit tentative. In the conservatism book, I often use convenient labels like libertarian or traditionalist to talk about certain kinds of conservatives. But of course, labels can sometimes take on a life of their own, which they ought not to have. I mean, for example, I might say of one person, he was a libertarian, and the students would think, well, in that case, he must have been opposed to the draft during the military draft during the Vietnam War, whereas in fact, that particular person wasn't opposed to it. And I'm able to say, well, it's true that this was someone who had libertarian economic ideas, but did recognize the citizen's duty on the other. That's really just a long way of saying that the more you know about your subject, the better you're going to be able to teach it. A few scholars sometimes even go so far as to change their field of research in order to increase its resonance with their teaching. We met an example of such a person this last year. Steve Pollock, the University of Colorado physics professor, switched his research from particle physics to research in physics education. He's now become an authority on the subject of physics teaching.
I'm involved in a community of the scholars of teaching and learning, and one of our goals is to try to influence both bottom up from the faculty and top down from university administrations to recognize that there is a scholarship of teaching and that needs to be valued as part of, it's part of what it means to be a faculty member. To be a scholar as a physicist also involves at all universities to be a scholar of teaching as well. The American Physical Society a decade ago established that physics education research is a legitimate form of physics research. That was a very politically influential statement. Many physics departments around the country took notice and said, well, okay, then we should give faculty credit for their publications in the education venue, which led to allowing me to be a faculty member in a physics department whose full-time research is in physics education. That's what I do now.
Only a minority of scholars are ever going to make teaching itself their principal research issue. But still, the option is a highly desirable one. Even if you don't switch to teaching as a field of research, there is still likely to be a connection between your research and your teaching. Listen to Scott Page's enthusiasm here as he talks about the relationship he established between a particular research problem and his teaching work.
It's clearly the case that your research drives how you teach. And one of the things I think is great about a place like Michigan is we take great pride in sort of teaching our undergraduates the stuff that we think is sort of cutting edge. So what we want to do is we want to go back and look at these three models. We want to look at these. But it's also the case it goes the other way. Like I wrote undergraduate notes on this concept of path dependence, but it was sort of very hard for people to understand because it was written by, actually by Russian mathematicians. It was incredibly hard for anybody to figure out. So I wrote just some really simple examples of how things could be path dependent, how outcomes could be path dependent, but how maybe the path could depend, but the equilibrium might not. So I just sort of logically worked through the whole thing for my undergraduates, and ended up writing a paper that's had a nice impact.
Now, in that instance, Professor Page had identified an area where the mathematical research was so complicated, most readers simply couldn't grasp it. But he was confident that the ideas were simplifiable. He wrote the simplified article, and it became a central part of his teaching. That's a lovely example of the mutual benefit of research and teaching. He's clearly bringing the two a little bit closer together. One of the ways to stay fresh and sharp is to try occasional innovations in your classroom and to keep your eyes open for the unexpected. Inspired teaching moments sometimes arise from within a class if you recognize them and if you make room for them. On the one hand, you've got to create a routine, but on the other hand, you've always got to be ready to deviate from the routine when something a little bit unexpected happens. Listen to Professor Hale as he describes an example of how he took advantage of an unexpected opportunity.
I had a student that I thought was the weakest in the class. This was about 10 years ago here at the University of Louisville. It was a moderate-sized Introduction to Archaeology and Prehistory class, so we were going through the different prehistoric periods. And about midway through, a student who had not spoken the entire time, and everybody else had been raising their hands, questions. I'd asked rhetorical questions of them, and they'd all have responses and answers. Not he. He sat at the back, kind of slouched, the tractor cap pulled over the eyes. I couldn't tell whether he was doodling in the notes or actually writing. But we got into the Paleolithic cave art in France, and up went his hand for the first time. And he pushed back his cap and sat up straight and said, after I had said, we now interpret this cave art as magic, that these caves were rites of initiation places in France and Spain and other parts of the Ice Age world. Young hunters went into these dark, torchlit places and were initiated into the mysteries, the spiritual mysteries of hunting and hunting magic. And he said, there's hunting magic here in Louisville. I'm a deer hunter. First time I went out with my dad and my uncle, I didn't know this was going to happen. But after I shot my first deer, they painted a mark on my forehead, and we went home and I ate the heart of that deer. And they said, now you're a hunter. Well, I invited up to the front of the class. This was all new to me. I'm not a hunter, and I'm not from a family that ever were hunters. And he then told the class about the other aspects of superstition, rituals that went along with hunting, and finally sat down. He talked every day from then on, because he felt he had something to bring to it. So in that sense, I think that kind of thing can come out in the classroom that's helpful to him, helpful to me, helpful to the whole class. And he, I think, started on the path of being a good teacher himself, just because he suddenly felt like, I'm the only person in the room who knows this, and it's my job to speak for what I know about to people who don't.
Once you become a qualified teacher, it's possible that the only person whose classes you'll ever go to are your own. Actually, it's a very good idea to visit other professors' classrooms to see who's doing something different. It's good to visit people who are teaching the same general topic as you, and it's good to go to totally different ones to get a sense of the available styles that are being practiced.
So powerfully useful to watch other faculty teach. You know, no matter how traditionally they lecture or how sort of radically and informed they lecture, no matter what it is, I'm learning new tricks, new ideas, new styles. And of course, when you're watching somebody else, you have the luxury of watching the students much more. When I'm lecturing, I'm kind of in the zone. If I want J, I could just hold my arms out and look at what's happening locally. It's very difficult for me to really connect with what all those students are doing and thinking, and that's so important for developing one's teaching. So watching other classrooms can be very, very useful for seeing how are the students responding to this? Are they paying attention? What's their conversation like? That sort of information is just invaluable.
Of course, it's always important to be courteous to your colleagues and to make sure that they're willing to have you there, that your presence isn't going to make them feel uncomfortable. But as Professor Pollock says, it's very, very useful because if you're sitting at the back of somebody else's room, you've got a student's eye view of the proceedings, and that's very different from having the professor's eye view, which you normally have. You're able to see, for example, if you let students bring in laptop computers, who's actually using the laptop to keep notes and who's using it to email their friends or browse the web at the same time. It's also a very good idea to experiment with team teaching. Many campuses now encourage it. Although you can learn a lot by visiting other professors' classes, there's perhaps no better way of learning about other teachers' styles than by actually teaching with them. The collaboration requires care because there's the danger that if you're loquacious, you're talkative, and that your colleague is too, the two of you between you might gulp up all the available energy in the room and monopolize the conversation. So you probably need to take an oath of self-restraint before you do that. We filmed an example of team teaching at Duke University where Steve Nowicki and his colleague Dan Keyhart were working together teaching the Darwinism seminar. There, because they wanted it to be student-centered, both professors would often maintain a principle of long silence before they finally intervened. If you're going to team teach, just make sure that you're not team teaching with someone who's got to have the last word or who's in any way intellectually insecure and can't stand an honest disagreement. I think it's appropriate for students sometimes to see that their teachers can disagree and that each can give good reasons for his or her own point of view. But obviously it would be lamentable if the two teachers got into a squabble with one another. If you're team teaching, meet with your team teacher as soon as the class is finished and give each other honest feedback about the quality of the interactions you had with the students because both of you were there. Now, you may find it odd, but another thing I found that helps prevent a sense of monotony setting in is the importance of physical fitness. As a teacher, I try to be as physically fit and active as possible, and I believe that it actually helps me teach better. If you look at any field of human endeavour, you nearly always find that the leaders in that field are themselves healthy and active. I remember an incident in this respect. When I was about 14, or 16, I guess, back in 1972, this was when the Fischer-Spassky Chess Championship took place, and it caught the whole world's attention. Everybody all around the world was watching these two great chess champions, both astonishing personalities. And I read that Fischer ran a lot and played tennis to keep himself physically fit. Despite the highly cerebral character of the game, in those days I had visions of myself being a great grandmaster, which I'm definitely not. But I thought, wow, look at that. Even these chess players, it isn't as though it's all pure mental activity. They're keeping themselves physically fit as well. I think just the same's true of teaching. It's more invigorating for students to be in the presence of healthy and active people. Academic life is very sedentary. And there are powerful temptations to not being active. In other words, the professional part of my job consists of lecturing 5 or 6 times a week, and then sitting in my office and sitting in the library doing research. It would be very easy to become extremely slack physically. When I was an undergraduate at Oxford, the whole place was full of people who are halfway to being chronic drunks because there's so much sherry being shared all the time, and there's so little incentive there, or there was in those days, to physical fitness. If you're physically fit, you probably feel better about yourself and about the world, and can more convincingly play the role of the enthusiastic teacher who's in no way jaded, even after decades in the classroom. Now, don't let me overstate this point. Of course it's true that disabled people can be great teachers. And it's equally true that people into advanced old age who've lost their physical vitality and vigour can still be very powerful teachers because so much of their work is cumulative. At the start of each new semester or new course, remind yourself of what an extraordinary thing you're doing as a teacher. Make sure that familiarity doesn't dull the bright edge of your sense of your own vocation. Here's Dr. Jeanette Norden at Vanderbilt giving a beautiful example of how she found an imaginative way to start each new course. And she reminds us to put ourselves in the position of the learner. This is one of the best ways of maintaining your enthusiasm for teaching.
I have something I do before the first day of class. On the very first day of class, I come into my office very, very early in the morning, and I sit at my desk and I do like a little meditation. And I honestly try to remember what it was like the first time I heard about the brain. Because I remember being an undergraduate and being on the edge of my seat. I had never heard anything that interesting. And so I try to recapture that feeling so that when I walk into the classroom on the very first day, I can walk in and I look at the students and there's just this energy coming out of me about you are going to hear about the most interesting thing you have ever heard about, ever.
Well, let's summarize the findings from this lecture and the things you can do with it. Research overwhelmingly affirms that students respond favorably to enthusiastic teachers. So it's highly desirable to remain enthusiastic despite the passage of time. Take each new course or each new semester as a new challenge. Even if you've taught the course content before, you haven't taught it to this particular group of students whom you're now facing. And in fact, the better you know the material, the more you can concentrate on classroom dynamics and on making a powerful impact on those young people. At the same time, you should be keeping up to date with research in your area of knowledge. And if possible, you should be participating in that research. If you are an active researcher, think conscientiously about apportioning your time between the research and the teaching. Try to avoid the obvious pitfall of devoting nearly all your time to one or the other. And try to find ways to give your students a glimpse of the work you do in your life as a researcher without overwhelming them. A sound mind in a sound body. It was a good idea in the days of the Roman poet Juvenal, and it's just as good today. You'll be a more impressive teacher if you're healthy and active. In the next lecture, I'll be talking about managing some of the challenges of teaching which can't be solved once and for all, and which you're going to have to confront every single time you undertake a new teaching project.